Hello and welcome to this interview where we'll be talking about a little discussed corner of World War II, the war in India against the Japanese and the siege of Kohima. And I'm joined by Luke Parker. How are you, sir?
Very well. Thank you, Bo.
And you are here on behalf of the Kohima Educational Trust.
I am, yes, yeah.
And that's an organisation that are dedicated to sort of, apart from anything else, really raising awareness for this part of the war and the indigenous people in India that live there.
Yeah, well, I want to raise awareness in order to raise the profile of the charity so that obviously we can give more back to the people, because the whole point of the charity started a veteran called Gordon Graham. He went back to Kohima 10 years after and he wrote a piece for, I think it was the Sunday Times, I can't remember now, called "The Trees Are All Young on Garrison Hill," which was one of the main features of the Kohima battle, particularly the siege. He went back, had a look round and realised that the country is poor and in need, and he thought the best way to give something back would be to help the children get an education. I think that is really important, that it was something along those lines, something that's really practical that will help the actual people. So, and I think as well, I think he'd been to a lot of services dedicated to the fallen soldiers and everything, and I think it felt hollow really to just concentrate on the soldiers, because the Naga people did so much that they needed to be remembered, basically.
Right. So they're the sort of indigenous peoples from that part of the world?
Yes, they are, yeah.
So let's try and put this story in context. One of the first things I would say about it is that a lot of the people that fought out there, or the 14th Army,
yes,
sort of been colloquially called the Forgotten Army. Mm-hmm. Because, so first of all, say it's the war in the Pacific, the war in the Far East against Japan. Now, most people's idea of that war is that the Americans fought over the Japanese islands. Yes. That was sort of it. It was a war just between Japan and America. But of course, the reality is that there's much, much more to it than that.
Yes.
And what we're going to talk about here, the Battle of Kohima, or the Siege of Kohima, is actually, we'll be drilling down quite a lot into that, drill down many layers before we get to there.
Yes.
So I thought maybe I could do sort of a bit of an overview, and we can talk about that as I go.
Yes.
Before we actually get to Kohima, so we can put it sort of fairly firmly in its context.
Cool.
So first of all, just to say, then, to start, that the Japanese aggression in the Far East, all through the 1930s, that they essentially invaded China, the Chinese incident, as they called it. And all of that is a massive story. But to cut that short, to just drill straight down into another layer, after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan sort of go all out to invade vast swathes of East Asia, all the way down into Indochina, which is modern Vietnam.
Huge expansion.
Burma,
huge.
Thailand, all of it.
Yes. I think, I know a historian called Robert Lyman, who's an absolute expert in this. He's the man who knows everything about this subject. He was saying Pearl Harbor was almost a distraction, really. Keep the American Navy from getting involved in what they wanted to do, because they really wanted to just expand. And they did, really. They succeeded very quickly. Probably too quickly, because I think they spread so far and wide that it was probably not possible to control it once they'd done it, because obviously once you've made that many enemies as well, and you've spread yourself so thin, there's at least going to be parts of you that are vulnerable. But well, and as well, by the time the Kohima battle started, the Japanese really, they weren't putting on any offensives at all. This was the very last land offensive that they had tried. It was a very, very much last-ditch effort.
You could say Kohima is sort of the higher watermark of the expansion of the Japanese Empire.
Yeah.
In the sort of westward, anyway.
Yes, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, they expanded all the way down. They took Singapore, famously, one of the British Empire's worst, in fact, one of our biggest surrenders ever, if not the biggest single surrender of men, was at Singapore.
Yeah.
And, they were starting to push on to, is worrying they might try and invade Australia and things.
Yes.
But it's interesting to note that we're going to be talking really about Burma and on into India itself. And so I'll put map up in post as always. But from a map, you can see that India and China have got a massive border with each other, which is largely the Himalaya range.
Yes.
However, if you get to the end of the Himalaya range, going eastwards, you end up at Burma or Myanmar.
Mm-hmm.
And so it can be described that Burma is a land bridge, in inverted commas, between India and China.
Yes, because the Himalayas, the eastern end of the Himalayas, they're called the Hump. They nicknamed it the Hump, which is where they took the supplies from Assam over into China.
So you'd have to fly over the hump.
Yeah, because obviously you can't, there's no other way around. So, which is apparently a horrible thing to do as well. It's really dangerous.
Well, yeah, I think, because the peak of Everest is up around cruising range, so cruising altitude. So, it wouldn't be a pleasant flight, I wouldn't have thought.
Not in an unpressurized cabin.
And so the Japanese, they started to invade Burma sort of straight away, that is to say, early in 1942, so not long after Pearl Harbor. Within a few months of Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops were pouring into Burma. Now, where, as I say, maybe the very low resolution, people think it was just the United States versus Japan. Well, it's actually the French, because Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, was French. There were lots of Dutch territories.
Yeah, the Dutch East Indies.
Right.
Yeah.
So actually, really, it was the United States, Great Britain, the Dutch and the French all had interests.
Yes.
And then, of course, India itself. I mean, India was part of the British Empire, and we had sort of one of their biggest capitals was in Calcutta, which is on that side of India.
Mm-hmm.
And so the British Empire is, a mixture of people as well. There was like Gurkhas involved and Australian troops, obviously Scots and Irish and Welsh. And
the actual, the Indian Army, the British Indian Army at Kohima was, I think it was over 80% Indian.
Right.
And it was, the Second World War kind of encouraged the British to recruit from other parts of India that weren't considered soldierly. So they actually had a mix of every part of India, that's the first time that had happened. And then consequently, when we left, when we withdrew from India altogether in 1947, we actually left them with a really decent army, which you need. If you're going to be a country, you do need it. So they really benefited from that.
And railroads.
And
civil service.
Yes.
Left with lots of things, actually.
Lots of naughty stuff as well.
And so, I haven't mentioned Singapore was one of our worst surrenders.
Yes.
One of our longest, I think it might be the longest fighting retreat, was across Burma. So the Japanese army invade.
Yes.
And the British army of what was there sort of essentially fought a very, very long, extended fighting retreat.
Yes.
All the way back, ultimately, mainly across northern Burma, all the way ultimately back into India itself.
A lot of them actually came through Kohima. A lot of the refugees, they set up stations, like cookhouses and everything, so they could feed them as they came through. Because, like you say, you had the army fighting a fighting retreat, but also you have a massive amount of people, because a lot of Indians lived in Burma, and as soon as the Japanese invaded, the tables just turned completely, and the Burmese wanted them out. So there was a huge amount of people moving, and a lot of people died.
Well, because everyone had seen how the Japanese treated the peoples under them, for example, in China, all throughout the 30s. The Japanese, especially sort of the military police and things, could be very, very brutal.
Yes.
And the British Empire, for all its faults, was just not the same beast.
No.
So people would rather live under the British Raj than the Imperial Japanese yoke. I mean, it was a no-brainer to nearly everyone, it seemed.
Yeah. I think if you're going to choose one between one or the other, then yeah, certainly.
And so the Japanese controlled Burma all this time. And as you mentioned, a lot came through Kohima. Again, I'll put a map up so everyone knows exactly what I mean. And I've said this in all sorts of epochs. It's true all over the world, especially in places where there's not a great deal of roads and a great deal of railways, is that you end up being funneled through some very specific valleys, quite often,
Yes,
some
yeah.
very specific passes. There's just sort of no other way around it. And anyway, Kohima and Imphal are on those. It's sort of, if you're going to go on foot or on a wagon or on a horse, even on a car, if you're going to go from northern Burma into India, there's just a very few, I think two main places you're going to be funneled into. And this is the small town of Kohima and another slightly bigger place, Imphal.
Imphal, yeah.
Right?
Well, yeah, there was only one main road, and went through both, but that runs north-south. But the Japanese, well, the refugees first came east to west, and then obviously the Japanese followed in 1944. But over no roads really. There was, they actually they sent a pioneer corps out, and they built bridges to try and make it as efficient as possible, and sorted all the tracks out so that when they marched through, they could cover the ground that they wanted to cover, because they had a time limit set by the rations, which was pretty insane. But yeah, well, that was a part of their undoing, but we'll come to that later.
So that is, I think, a big part of this story. Perhaps one of the sort of fundamental things to say near the beginning is that how few roads there were, and the nature of the terrain in northern Burma and that part of sort of extreme eastern India is, everyone agrees, some of the most extreme ground you can fight on.
Yeah, I think I would go so far as to say it's some of the most extreme ground you could go for a walk on.
Right.
Literally, it's you've got mountains, they're covered in jungles. The valley bottoms, if it's warm weather, it's deathly humid, horrible mosquitoes, leeches, and all that. And then you get up onto the mountain sides in the summer, in the hot months, it's absolutely boiling. It's red hot. And then when you get to the top of them mountains, you could be baking during the day, and then it could be hailstorms on a night. Like, they get some pretty extreme weather, even when it's not the monsoon. But then obviously when the monsoon hits, you're on mountains that are made of mud, basically then. And you can't, obviously, all the positions, nearly every position is always at the top of a hill. We're generally in a village, so yeah, you're always walking to the top of an hill, basically.
so it's jungle, rainforest, really. And I've been to some tropical parts of the world before, gone through jungle, and there's jungle, and then there's real hardcore jungle, and this is as crazy as it gets. I mean, anyone that knows about Vietnam and Vietnam experience, it's sort of that level. It's sort of as challenging as jungle can be, where there's there's giant insects. Not most things. A lot of things are poisonous.
Yeah,
a lot of things are looking to kill you.
Basically,
insects and plants and everything.
Well, my grandfather was a Chindit, and they were obviously in the jungle. And he said a few times, it's like, take the Japanese out of the equation completely, that would have still been awful.
Right, yeah.
It would have still been a real massive challenge.
Right.
To get over it. But
so a lot of them, the casualties are more from disease than from combat.
Yes, yeah.
So you mentioned the Chindits there. Let's before we get on to Kohima itself,
yes,
let's talk a touch about the Chindits. So it was the British and Americans, actually. It's one of those things where different nations quite often like to take credit for things entirely. So we like to think, the British like to think, we fought the war against the Japanese in Burma. But there was a lot of Americans there.
There was, yeah.
So when Japan took Burma, one of the things we did under General Wingate is to put together some sort of commando stroke early proto special forces chaps that got called Chindits.
Yeah.
And they were not parachuted, glided deep behind enemy lines, sometimes a couple 100 miles behind enemy lines, sometimes for months on end, long range penetration groups.
That's what they call them. Yeah,
so like the SAS in North Africa, but for much longer, much deeper behind enemy lines. So like the SAS, but more intense, if anything. And these guys were called the Chindits.
Yes.
And your grandfather was one.
Yes, he was.
And their experiences were horrific by and large, weren't they?
Yeah, it didn't sound right nice, definitely. I think he said he weighed about 5.5 stone when he came back out. And he was there he was out for 3 months.
That's close to death then, as an adult man, to be that.
Yeah, well, he was pretty much exactly the same size as me. So, like, I'm 5'8" or whatever, and I weigh 11 stone. So yeah, they were
it'd be close to organ failure and death. So he's lucky he survived.
Yeah, and I think really he probably got to that weight purely because he got all the way to the end of it. He managed to survive the whole thing. Because a lot of lads, they were coming out full of malaria or cholera, typhoid, all manner of diseases. Some of them,
dysentery is a big one.
Oh yes. Well, not only that, the Naga Hills apparently has a huge magnesium level in the water.
Oh really? I didn't know that. This is new to me.
So apparently, even without dysentery, it's going through you basically. So yeah. So they were, even if they weren't ill, they were probably suffering from diarrhea.
So exactly as you say, even take the Imperial Japanese Army out of the equation, to spend months on end, like you say, a couple of months, sometimes up to 5 months, I understand.
There was
deep in the jungle there, and
there's one African brigade that apparently were out for 9 months. They were out for the longest out of anybody.
Wow. So, and that's a survival ordeal.
Oh yeah.
Unless you really learn how to survive off the jungle, you're not going to make it.
No, you brown bread. Yeah, definitely.
The leeches you mentioned, many accounts, lots of accounts are sort of the leeches, yeah, and sores. Well, you mentioned monsoon. During the monsoon season, obviously you're constantly drenched, really, drenched.
Yeah.
And when it's not monsoon season, it's so humid anyway that you're essentially wet through.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to be carrying giant packs. You're supposed to be marching all the time. One of the, as I'm sure you know, one of the sort of sayings of the Chindits, or informally anyway, if you don't march, you die. That was sort of accepted, not a saying, sorry. It was just an accepted fact that if you can't march, they probably will have to leave you behind.
Yes. And I think on Operation Longcloth in 1943, the first Chindit operation, and they marched in and marched back out. There was no gliders. It was all on foot. But that was I've forgotten my point.
Or a horrific experience for them.
Well, yeah. There was something specific about that I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was.
Well, the sores, because if your feet are so sore that you can't march anymore.
Sorry,
that's it.
That is what I was going to say. So basically, on the first operation, if you fell by the wayside, and they did use that phrase, those exact words, you were given like enough ammunition to kill yourself, basically. And you did just literally get left. There were a really, really minute amount of people who survived, and some of them went native, and they found them in 1944. When they went back, just living with natives. But by the time by the time Operation Thursday came about in 1944,
that's the second big Chindit
operation. It was a lot better organised. They had strongholds with actual airstrips, so that it was possible. It still wasn't a guarantee, but it was definitely much more possible to get people out. And the Nagas helped a great deal with the Chindits that operated around Kohima, specifically the Angami Nagas around there. They were instrumental, really.
Oh God, absolutely, yeah. All these things where you find Western or American or Australian troops or something fighting extremely far-flung, extremely remote corners of the world, and then they're always absolutely relying on the indigenous people.
They called one of the jungle saws specifically the Naga saw, and apparently that would it's that quite small, and it'd just spread, but it'd go really deep into your flesh, really eat into your skin and your muscles and everything, and cause some right damage.
Well, eventually, if it goes septic, it gets infected, you get blood poisoning, and then you're done, really.
Yeah, sepsis in it, yeah.
Right, yeah. And so that's the thing, in jungles, in extremely hot and humid places like this, and you're in the jungle, sort of almost any open wound will almost certainly get infected.
Yes.
And you'll get sores from all over your feet and from carrying a pack and all sorts of things, just by the nature of being damp all the time and moving around all the time, let alone any sort of nick or cut.
Yeah, it's really, it's not worth cutting yourself at all in that environment.
And so it was only really the fittest of the fit that would kind of hope to survive in a way.
Yes.
You know, for the Chindits, I know that they didn't really want people over the age of 30 because you're past your prime.
And
they need young men. They need guys that are like 24, 25 and as fit as possibly could be. And even they often just didn't survive.
They called it an RTU. So if you faltered in the training, they'd just give you this RTU, return to unit,
right,
and they'd send you back.
Well, that's a famous thing, isn't it? That the Chindit training was extremely arduous.
Oh man!
Like most guys would get malaria during the training or something.
Yeah, well, the thing is, it's the old adage of train hard and fight easy.
Right.
So if you've trained with malaria, then at least you have half an idea what it might be like to fight with malaria, because you're not going to have an option. You're going to have to fight. So yeah, it's extreme, I think, is the best word really to describe the training, because one account, they marched for a full day and a full night. They did river crossings, and then right at the very end of it, they had to put in a mock attack onto a village. And he said, well, like, you're not functioning properly because you're not there, you're exhausted. And obviously, a lot of them will have been poorly while they were training, like you say, so it'll have been absolutely horrible. And I imagine a lot of people will have fallen out, definitely, but...
Yeah, I mean, malaria is no joke. Absolutely no joke. There's this thing, there's some sports, aren't there, where, like footballers really, if they've got any sort of injury, they just don't play.
Yeah.
There's other people, more like rugby players or MMA fighters.
Yeah.
They talk about, you're always injured.
Yeah.
You're sort of always, you're playing and you're always carrying some sort of injury. They said that about the Chindits. It's like you're fighting, but you're actually always unwell or slightly wounded or something or other, or just suffering from dysentery whilst having to march through the hardest jungles on earth and then fight off, hopefully, Japanese ambushes or something. I mean, yeah, extreme is the word, I think.
Yes.
Very, very extreme. And it's a shame, and that's what we're trying to do here. It's a shame that a lot of people haven't even heard of the Chindits. Yeah. They don't know anything about the war in Burma or the siege of Kohima or anything at all.
I think the Chindits is about the only one that people might have heard of, but heard of. Right. You know what I mean? Yeah. They won't know anything about it, but like, oh yeah, I've heard of that before. But it's quite good in a way, because if you want to talk to people about stuff, like most people know about what happened in Normandy and all that, don't they? Like that side of the war, like the European side's really incredibly well documented, and especially anything where the Americans were involved, like they've photographed and videoed like most of what was going on. So there's absolutely huggings of information. And then you look at northern India and Burma. I mean, you're not taking one of them old 1940s cameras out in a monsoon, so you're not getting any photos when that's going on. And generally, you're probably not getting many journalists who actually had the inclination to go out there and to cover it. They really didn't bother.
Yeah, well, a small note on that. I know that specifically the Chindits, who were only actually one small part, really, of that whole war effort in Burma. They were sort of the commando guys. But on their expeditions, you weren't allowed to take cameras. A couple of guys did smuggle them in anyway.
Yes, yeah.
So there are a few pictures of Chindits actually in action and stuff. But yeah, at Kohima, for example, as big as it is, and some historians have said it's sort of a war-turning battle.
Yeah.
There's about 10 hours worth of footage, I believe. I saw somewhere someone say that, which is to say, not very much at all.
Oh God, no. Well, that'll be, if there's 10 hours of footage, there's probably 9 hours of just garbage.
Right, yeah. So, but yeah, out of just this giant event. But that's often the way it goes in wars, isn't it? Sort of D-Day is the big famous thing, or Dunkirk or something.
Yeah, and they're also, D-Day happened on the 6th of June, and there was a big build-up to it. There's obviously, it was secret, but it was obvious we were building up towards something. And I think just the Indian conflict just really did just get forgotten about, especially over 1944, 1945. It wasn't important, really. It wasn't important immediately to what most of people in Britain were going through.
Right, okay,
Wasn't really relevant.
I see what you mean. Because I'd say, obviously, strategically, it was massively important. But what you
Yeah.
mean there, I think, and I would agree with, is that it wasn't important to sort of the consciousness of the people in Britain.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. They were told, we need to defeat Mr. Hitler in Germany, and that's the main thing.
Yeah.
And that the Americans are slowly winning the war in the Pacific. And you're not really told about all the division, the 14th Army, isn't it? The 14th Army
yes,
in
but
India.
Conversely, though, unless you had a brother who was fighting in Europe or some relatives who were fighting in Europe, the Chindits weren't very interested in what were going on in Europe. They were in the jungle suffering massively. It's like, I don't care. I don't care if you're storming a beach in Normandy. I'm here doing this. Because I think, and as well, I think it would be easy, really, really easy to get sucked into your own part of what's going on, because if you're fighting a war, it's possibly the most visceral, extreme scenario that you're going to go through in your life. And when you've trained with all these other lads, they'll be like your family. So when they get killed, like, you're not going to be thinking about Hitler at that point, are you? That's just really not going to matter when you've got your mate with his guts hanging out, dying in front of you. That's just really not going to be important. And I imagine if you went anywhere in the world during the Second World War, I think it would be the same. I think people would be really, really tunnel vision on their own scenario.
Yeah, and you're encouraged to be, right?
Yeah.
That's the way you do your job. You say they're like family. In a sense, a lot of men say this, that they're closer than family, that in some senses, in combat, the buddies that you share, and they had an actual buddy system in the Chindits, but your buddies, metaphorically or actually, in the trench with you, you form a closer bond than anything else in your whole life. So often closer than your own children and things.
Yeah.
Is that you can never have a stronger bond than that. And so it's sort of ultra intense again, that sort of the human aspect.
I wonder if that plays into the concept of the quiet fathers, the guys that just came back, didn't talk very much unless they got angry, really. And it broke a lot of men.
Oh, absolutely. Did your grandfather talk about it much that you remember? At all?
Yeah, he talked about it a lot.
Right.
Yeah, he was quite
some
unusual.
do, yeah, a lot go quiet, but some,
yeah,
it's all they want to talk about. I mean, that's much rarer, but that certainly does happen, doesn't it?
It was, up until my grandmother died, he talked about it, but he talked about a lot of what went on in India whilst he was training and all the, the stuff that went on. Because he spent 4 years out there, but he spent 3 months in actual combat. So there's a massive amount of experience just being out in India, and he loved it. He loved that place. He learned a lot of Hindi. With taxi drivers around where we live are often Asian, so like, if we got in a taxi, then he'd be talking in Hindi regardless of whether they talked Hindi or not. But he just absolutely loved the place. He loved the people. I think he could have easily stayed in the army and he could have lived in India. I think he would have been happy with that, but obviously he came home and
he was at Kohima, I understand.
It was the Chindits. The Chindits were not trained for anything to do with Kohima, but one brigade got left in reserve, and then they got taken. Slim took them for Kohima, and they got sent.
General Slim, the leader
General
of the
Slim,
British,
yeah, the main man. They were sent around the flanks of the Japanese. So as the Japanese were coming in, they were coming around the back of them, really. And then they were sort of village hopping, trying to weed the Japanese out of the villages as they went.
So just to say, the Chindits aren't necessarily particularly associated with the Siege of Kohima itself,
No,
but there were some there, and your grandfather
Yes, yeah.
happened to be one of them.
Yeah, so the 23rd Brigade, that's their brigade. Their battle honours are Kohima.
Right. Okay.
So,
Wow.
but
right.
all the rest of them are Operation Thursday.
Okay. Right. Yeah. So just before we get on to the actual details of when the Japanese pushed into Info and the Siege of Kohima itself, just a few more words. Just to say, I'd like to mention that that it wasn't just British commandos.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.